Just like the controversy surrounding the Panama Canal, President-elect Donald Trump also made promises to buy Greenland, which currently belongs to Denmark. Denmark is a traditional ally of the United States. Once again, the media portrayed the entire situation as just another one of Trump's bluffs. In this video, I will explain the roots of this Greenland crisis. Greenland is a large island, in fact, the largest island located within the Arctic Circle. It is formally a possession of Denmark and one of the most unexplored territories in the world because the Danish government simply doesn't have the resources to explore it. The territory of Greenland holds great strategic importance for Denmark, for North Atlantic politics, and also for the Arctic Circle. Greenland lies on the shortest path between Washington and Moscow. If you want to take a direct flight between the two major capitals, you will have to pass over Greenland's territory. This is why Greenland's territory is also called Midway, meaning the middle of the way between the two great powers, and it was considered as such throughout the Cold War. Going back a little in history, Greenland was discovered around 1,000 years ago when the first Viking voyages set out from Scandinavia and headed west, first reaching Iceland, then Greenland, and eventually North America, where colonies established by Leif Erikson were founded around the year 1000 AD. In 1261, these Greenland colonies submitted to the sovereignty of Norway. However, in 1537, Norway and Denmark entered into a union known as Denmark-Norway. This geopolitical arrangement remained active for the next 300 years, until the early 19th century, in 1814, when, through a treaty, the two countries were separated, and all overseas possessions, all colonies, were ceded by Norway to Denmark. At that time, there were very few people living in Greenland, and it was only from the 1880s onward that small Denmark began its efforts to recolonize Greenland. But before that, some very important things happened. The first of them was in 1823, when the President of the United States, James Monroe, imposed the Monroe Doctrine. The main objectives of the Monroe Doctrine were to prohibit the creation of new European colonies in the Americas, to prevent European countries from interfering in the decisions of the Americas, to avoid involving the United States in conflicts between European countries, to defend the independence of Latin American countries. These were the main objectives of the Monroe Doctrine, which secured the United States' position as the leader of the Americas. Another important event was in the 1870s when the Polar Expedition, a U.S. scientific mission, came very close to the Arctic. Upon realizing that northern Greenland was essentially uninhabited, they claimed sovereignty over the northern part of the island. In 1867, the same year the United States purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire, the fact that Greenland was virtually uninhabited led the White House to begin studies on acquiring the island. Although these studies indicated that such a purchase would benefit the United States by providing a continental defense platform, no real proposal was made to the Danish government at that time. In 1910, once again, the US government considered making a purchase proposal to Denmark, this time offering portions of the Philippines in exchange for the sovereignty of Greenland, so that the Danes could exchange those portions with the Germans for the return of the northern part of the Schleswig-Holstein province. But, once again, these negotiations came to nothing. Now, let's move to another part of history within this context. The territory now known as the U.S. Virgin Islands was previously a Danish overseas territory called the Danish West Indies. So, until the early 20th century, the ownership of these three large islands belonged to Denmark. It was a colony established more than 200 years earlier, and for the last 100 years, it had been a significant financial burden because internally, it was not possible to replace the slave labor that had been abolished in 1848. So these three islands, instead of being profitable for Denmark, were actually a financial burden. The Americans then made an offer to purchase the Danish West Indies, a process that was completed in 1917 when the United States paid $25 million for the archipelago. In addition to the $25 million, the Americans also fulfilled a requirement from Denmark, which was to recognize Danish sovereignty over Greenland. By the late 1930s, the United States included Greenland in its Rainbow Four plan, a hemispheric defense plan aimed at protecting the US against a simultaneous attack from multiple enemy powers. This plan involved the prior occupation of various European territories in the Americas, including Greenland, which would be occupied by the Americans in one of the first steps of this potential conflict. With the arrival of World War II, Greenland's history would change forever. On April 9, 1940, the German army invaded Denmark, and in less than 6 hours, Denmark surrendered. Because Denmark was a very small country, unlike other European nations that were attacked and occupied by the Germans, its leaders were unable to escape. This meant there was no Danish government in exile, unlike with France, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and others. In this situation, the Danish ambassador to the United States, Henrik Kaufmann, negotiated unilaterally with the White House, a treaty allowing the United States to militarily occupy Greenland to prevent the Germans from using the island during the war. The treaty that Henrik Kaufmann signed with the United States was considered illegal by the Danish government, which was under German occupation at the time, and it also didn't have a set expiration date. According to the terms agreed upon, the Americans could stay there indefinitely if they wanted to. This meant that even before the US officially entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they had already established military bases in Greenland about 6 months before the Japanese attack. When the war ended in 1945, a new global scenario emerged: the Cold War. At that time, US President Harry S. Truman and his Secretary of State, James Burns, made an offer to purchase Greenland from Denmark. James Burns offered at the time $100 million in gold bars, which would be approximately $1 billion today, for the sovereignty of the island, an offer that was promptly rejected by the Danish government representatives. Denmark, in fact, wanted to begin negotiations for the Americans to withdraw from Greenland, but the growing Soviet military power and the formation of NATO in 1949, of which Denmark is a founding member, made the American withdrawal from the island quite unfeasible. On April 27, 1951, the two countries signed the Greenland Defense Treaty. This treaty established in Greenland what are known as defense areas, which are areas that the United States government considers extremely important for the defense of its own territory, and also for NATO territories in the Arctic. Within these defense areas, the United States had full autonomy to operate ships, land vehicles, and aircraft, as well as to build any military infrastructure deemed necessary for defense and the continuity of operations in that territory. Through this agreement, the Thule Air Base in the northern part of the country was established and expanded, and it was recently transferred to the newly created United States Space Force, now known as the Patuxent Space Base. This base was heavily used by the Pentagon throughout the Cold War. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the US presence in Greenland decreased significantly, and the country once again became dependent on subsidies from Denmark. However, the money Denmark sent to Greenland was very little and barely sufficient to make the necessary investments in the country. To this day, many villages in Greenland are not connected by roads, and the country only has a few commercial airports, whose expansion is difficult due to financial constraints. Due to all these limitations, Greenland remains one of the most unexplored territories in the world, even though people have been living there for centuries. In 2007, the White House stated that Greenland's independence is an inevitable fact. Today, Greenland is considered a highly independent territory, autonomous from Denmark, and the Danish government itself states that any potential independence of Greenland is a matter to be decided by its own citizens and the Greenlandic Parliament. On the other hand, the United States views the abandonment of Greenland as a significant security risk, given that the island has 44,000 square kilometers that are essentially unmonitored, and various vessels from other nations have been seen using its territorial waters for various purposes. To give you an idea, the Arctic Command of the Danish Armed Forces currently has only 1 fixed-wing aircraft, 4 helicopters, 4 boats, and 6 dog sleds to patrol the entire island of Greenland. Additionally, Chinese presence on the island has been growing significantly in recent years, which is not welcomed by the United States. This presence began in 2005 when China made billion-dollar investments in Greenland, particularly in the mining sector, which now makes up 11.5% of the island's GDP. In 2006, the Greenlandic Parliament also authorized China to build a scientific base on its territory. And in 2018, the Chinese government declared itself a semi-Arctic nation, reflecting the increasing importance the Arctic has in its foreign policy. In response, in 2019, the United States obtained permission from Denmark to open a consulate in Greenland. And that same year, President Donald Trump initiated studies for a new proposal to buy Greenland from Denmark. These studies, which even had the support of several US senators, did not result in a formal purchase proposal, which was evaluated at around $500 billion after the discovery of mineral reserves on the island. However, the mere idea of selling the territory was seen as ridiculous and unthinkable by both the Danish government and the Greenlandic Parliament. The Danes also point out that, unlike the Danish West Indies in the Caribbean, Greenland carries a whole Viking cultural heritage that associates the territory with Denmark's way of life, thus making it an inalienable part of their nation, which could only be separated by a decision from its own inhabitants. On the other hand, at the same time, the Prime Minister of Denmark stated that she would welcome the increase of US military presence on the island, as Denmark itself faces serious difficulties in expanding its own defense budget to secure Greenland. With Donald Trump's re-election to the White House in 2024 and the start of his new term, we can expect a new round and a reheating of this entire issue. As we know, a proposal to buy the island is strongly rejected by the people of Denmark and Greenland itself, but perhaps the White House will pursue this goal through other means. One of these means could be influencing Greenland's independence movement, pushing the country to fully separate from Denmark and potentially fall under US influence, just like Puerto Rico is today. Another alternative is that Donald Trump could pressure Denmark to spend 2% of its GDP on defense, a target set but not met by the European NATO members. If Denmark wishes to remain outside these obligations, it could hand over the sovereignty of Greenland to the United States. Well, these are just a few scenarios of what could eventually happen in this Greenland crisis triggered by Donald Trump's statements. But now tell me, what do you think will happen? Will Trump really pursue this issue with Denmark over Greenland's sovereignty, or is it just a bluff from the US president? Leave your opinion in the comments.